loose items in the pouch in front of you.
Have a safe and informative journey.
Hello, I'm Nathan Hartman, and this is Dreamfinders, a podcast about the creative culture of Disney theme parks. Tom K. Morris, like many kids, saved up his money from a paper route. Unlike everyone else, he took that money and went to the opening of Disney World by himself. That determination would serve Tom well over the years as he joined Imagineering and found himself working on all sorts of memorable projects. Tom chats with me about helping legends Claude Coates and Marc Davis design World of Motion, creating the layout for Journey into Imagination, and later taking on one of the most important projects any Imagineer could, an actual Disney castle. All of that and more is coming right up on Dreamfinders. Tom K. Morris, thanks so much for coming on Dreamfinders.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So you've had a hand in many aspects of making Disney a thrilling creative experience over the years, but I'm curious about what drew you into creativity. Were you a creative child? What was your sort of creative history?
Yeah, I guess I was. I was interested in a lot of things, animation, film, architecture. Yeah, I guess I followed those general veins of interest. And my dad was an art teacher in high school. He was an art and English teacher. So I suppose I got some of my interest drawn from that. I think probably the first career that I thought about kind of seriously, and I was probably only 7 or 8 years old, was animation. And I think it was after seeing The Jungle Book. Came out originally.
Yeah.
Now I've dated myself.
Was animation sort of your primary creative outlet, or did you find yourself sort of dabbling in a bunch of different ones, or?
Dabbling in different ones because animation was a mystery back then, and the only thing really even written about it that was even somewhat serious was the Art of Animation book, which I had to save up a long time for because it was $10, and and even that really didn't. It kind of told you the basic skills that you needed to follow, but there certainly weren't animation classes in junior high school or high school or anything like that. So that's where I kind of started to get more into architecture. And I took 3 years of drafting, of very serious drafting in high school. And that was kind of leading towards architecture. And I was interested in like planning, master planning and city planning and that sort of thing.
What I think is interesting about your story is a lot of people get into the creative process and then they sort of get into the, their love of Disney around the same time. And they kind of, if they have that ability, they then go to Disney as either a kid or, they go and get a job or whatever. But you have this very interesting sort of background that at 12, you went to the opening of Disney World.
That's right. So my interest in Disneyland, I would say it was a normal Southern California kid whose family went once a year to the park. And, I liked it a lot. And it was something like Christmas that you looked forward to. And maybe a little bit more interest than most, but it wasn't, a huge interest until my dad got a job there as a summer host, attractions host. And that was on the Pirates of the Caribbean the first year that it opened, summer '67. And he took me to the park one night in August of 1967 and took me into the Pirates of the Caribbean and also to the new Tomorrowland. And that really opened up my eyes to like, okay, here's another kind of interesting thing. And I don't think I thought of it as a career at the time, but I was really fascinated by this Imagineering thing. And he told me a little bit about WED Enterprises, to the extent that any cast member might know about it. And so I kind of knew that was out there. But Pirates of the Caribbean really fascinated me. And of course, the Haunted Mansion too, when it opened. And then I had a couple friends in high school and they were interested in it too. And so we would start to go to Disneyland a couple times a year. And then that became 3 times a year. And then it became 4 times a year. And that was considered kind of weird back then. People didn't go, they might go twice a year, or your parents might actually go without you. Like mine went without the family to go dancing at Carnation Gardens, once or twice a summer. But you as a kid really, it was unusual, I think, at the time to go to Disneyland that often. And at some point I was considering like a fifth trip to the park. And I remember my mom saying, if you go one more time, we're taking you to a psychiatrist.
So how do you get from like deciding on a fifth trip to making your way all the way to Florida for Disney World?
Yeah, I often ask myself the same question. Like, why was I so determined to do that? And I think it was just because I was at the point where I was really intrigued. I was starting to get intrigued with Disneyland history. And back then it was before the internet, and you couldn't even get old pictures of Disneyland. So like I would stumble on an old guidebook, and the old guidebook might have old pictures of Disneyland, it was shocking to see, because if you were used to kind of this Disneyland of 1970, and then you go back and look at these really crude pictures of Disneyland and the construction of it, it was very intriguing. And I think with the notion of Disney World being built, it was like, this is my only chance to kind of go back in time and see what a Disneyland is like on opening day. And I was convinced that I wanted to do that. It was a strange conviction. And, I wasn't even really at the zenith, I guess, of my, fascination or obsession with Disneyland at the time. But there was a guy on my paper route, and his name was Jack Sayers, and he was a very important player in the Disneyland history. And he was an executive with Disneyland and Walt Disney World. And he was in charge of lessee relations, basically corporate alliances. But, that included everything from Bank of America and General Electric all the way down to the guy who runs, the portrait artists and, and the glass cutters and the balloon sellers and all of that. So, and he helped facilitate, when I told him that I was saving my paper route money, because he was on my paper route, to fly to Disney World, he helped me out, not with the money, but he helped me out with getting an escort while I was out there, and being taken care of while I was out there.
It's sort of a wonderful sort of nerdy walkabout to take at such a young age.
It is. I still can't believe I did it, actually. I don't remember, I have a really good memory about a lot of things. And I took about 50 photographs that day, right? I probably had 3 or 4 rolls of film. And so, what I can find, or maybe it's more than 50, but it's like 4 rolls of film, four rolls of 24. So that's my memory of Disney World, because I looked at those pictures, off and on so many times that I've kind of forgotten about the interstitial moments, and maybe how did I get from, one point to another point. But it was definitely a very unusual thing to have done. And by the way, when growing up in the late 60s in Southern California, there were enough Disney executives or people in the know sprinkled throughout Southern California to start a whole bunch of kind of like miscommunicated rumors, like a bad game of telephone, the game of telephone where the piece of information gets kind of, messed up after the second or third telling. And so, that's probably why the rumor of the Haunted Mansion, all these weird things happening with the Haunted Mansion and the delays and everything were perpetuated. But there was also a perpetuation of the notion that Disney World was not going to be built, even while it was being built. So that was like a delayed rumor, because, right after Walt died, there was a couple months, I guess, where they did consider, or they put it on hold and they considered not doing it. And yet that rumor perpetuated almost up until the time it opened. It was like, are they going to do it or are they not going to do it? And then all of a sudden there's a TV special on, about the opening. So that was another thing that I guess kind of intrigued me. Like, okay, they're going to build this Disney World. It's going to open. It's going to be the only time I can like kind of get an idea of what it's like to be at a Disney park on opening day. So I'm going to go.
To give people an idea of how you sort of evolved from here, 2 years later, you technically get a job at Disneyland before the company will hire you.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even really want to do it that much. I mean, it was kind of like, oh, well, the opportunity is there, so I should jump on it. And that, again, goes back to Jack Sayers, who I guess on one of my trips to Disneyland that summer, before going into high school, I was talking to one of the balloon boys or balloon guys. They didn't seem like boys to me. They were older. But then there was one that was kind of like my age. And he said, oh, yeah, I'm only 14. They hire at 14. I go, how can they do that? It's like, well, it's a separate company. It's a lessee. I'm like, oh, I know the guy in charge of lessees. So I guess it was like, oh, I know the guy in charge of lessees, so I should do this. Not thinking this is going to disrupt your life through high school, and I'm going to have to get my hair cut, which was not something that was cool back then. The kids in Orange County, California in the mid 70s did not have Disneyland host hair, So I kind of had to deal with that and, just keeping up with school. And I didn't really have time for a lot of extracurricular activities because I worked every weekend. And I didn't work school days, but I worked weekends and holidays. And I kept it up until my senior year in high school when Disney took over the balloon concession, and then I moved into attractions. So I've basically been working since then, the way I look at it, until I left Imagineering a couple of years ago, which is one of the reasons why I'm kind of like not in a hurry to hop into another role right now. Because it's like, I've worked my entire life.
Do you feel that like you sort of mentioned like how you sort of fall into the balloons and then it sort of evolves and then it continues to evolve. By the time you start working for Disney, you hadn't even completed college, I don't think. You were sort of midway through when they wanted you in WDI, or? Yeah. Back then, called WED Enterprises. And Disneyland had started a program sometime in the mid 70s, where it was a career opportunity placement program, and you submit a resume. They wanted basically any cast members back then who had an interest in having a career with the company. They wanted kind of a database of that. And they wanted, and I think that the real reason was they knew that they were going to start Epcot and Tokyo Disneyland. So they were going to need to expand. Not only were they going to need people up in Burbank, but they would need people in Anaheim to backfill all of those roles. So I think probably when I was a junior, I may have, junior or senior, I put in a resume and I submitted a portfolio of the work that it was work that I was working on in high school, illustration and drafting. And I just to get it in the system. And then I started going to college at Cal State Fullerton, and I was focusing on communications. And, I was really kind of torn in a lot of different directions because in the 70s, like your counselors in high school, your teachers, and the people you looked up to didn't necessarily look fondly upon the idea of going to work in animation. And they didn't even know what Imagineering was, but it sounded weird to them. So, it was like, oh, you need to broaden your skills. Who's to say they're going to ever hire you? You need to do all these other things. And by the way, they don't pay artists very well. They don't pay creative people very well, blah, blah. You should think about marketing. You're really good at my basic writing skills and communication skills were very good. That's really where I excelled in school besides art. And so I was kind of pushed a little bit more into like advertising, basically advertising and marketing. And I thought, well, all this other stuff, and journalism and film. So that's what I really started concentrating on in college. And I continued to take illustration classes, but I was really beginning to refocus on film and advertising and marketing. What was your first title in Imagineering? What did it entail?
Apprentice draftsman. And it was in the show set design department, which was a part of architecture, part of the architecture department. But it was focused on the interior sets and ride layouts of the attractions. And at the time, it was the ride layout, department. The engineers didn't lay out the rides unless it was a coaster. And that's still kind of true to this day. It really kind of depends on who's leading the project. But back then, the layouts were done either by someone like Claude Coates or by someone like Claude would entrust in the show set department. I was hired into that because that department notified Disneyland, I think, that they had all these openings. Well, this was about the time where that big ad came out that said that I'm sure you've seen it. Mickey wants you, like the old Uncle Sam thing. And so this is like around 1978, and so now they are serious about building Epcot and Tokyo Disneyland, and they need all people in all of these different fields, not just creative. And so this career planning and placement department at Disneyland really kicked in. It became a real thing that, they were gathering all of these resumes and portfolios, and now they were actually taking action on it. And they had a couple of headhunters full time that were going through all of these resumes and lining them up with all of the job requirements up at not only at WDI, but also at the studio that was gearing up again in animation. So people were being cradle robbed out of Disneyland and out of the local colleges and out of CalArts and UCLA and USC to go up and start working at Disneyland. And some people were lucky enough to be able to finish their school first, and other people like me were right in the middle of it. And so I interviewed with George Windrum, who was the head of the show set design department, and he wanted me right away. And this was all based on my high school drafting portfolio. It had nothing to do with the illustrations that I had done or with, the film classes I was taking or the communications classes. This was all, he can draft real well because I had taken 3 years of it in high school. We need draftsmen, hire this guy.
What ends up being the first job that you sort of get thrown? I mean, I think the term thrown on would probably be the best call. They're eager, you're eager, but inexperienced.
Right.
Where did you find yourself?
Like a lot of jobs, you do some weird grunt work for a couple of weeks, cutting mat boards and labeling presentation boards. There was a great data book. It was called the Design Data Book that George Windrum and his department put together. That was, at the time, the only way that you could get an idea of what's the ride layout for Pirates of the Caribbean? How big is it? How many square feet is it? What's the throughput? What's the dispatch interval and all of that? I think I remember working on one entry into that data book. So I think it's kind of like it was like a test, to see if I was real or not. So I think I did that for like 2 or 3 weeks, but it wasn't long before I was doing some minor design work already on like a phone booth for the Land Pavilion. And then I was needed on the World of Motion, which, at the time I didn't realize this, but there were like 14 art directors on it. Not 14, but there were a lot. It wasn't just Marc Davis or Claude Coates. It was Marc Davis and Claude Coates and Ward Kimball and a guy named Paul Clatworthy, who was a famous art director, and Jack Martin Smith, who was a famous art director. And the architect of the building also was being very vocal about art directing elements of the show. So one of those people asked me to start designing, I think it was a pagoda for the invention of the wheel scene, and then a Greek temple, and the reason this was happening was usually the model shop works directly from either Claude or Marc Davis's drawings or whoever is the show designer. But they were short of model builders. They were short of anyone that can kind of draw up or interpret some drawings from either Marc or from Claude. And so they needed someone to kind of start infilling, because even Marc at the time was already retired, and so he was part-time, and Claude was busy with 12 different things. So I was doing kind of these little infill, like, oh, we need a thing over here, we need a pagoda over here, and we need a Greek temple over there. And I think Ward Kimball was calling those shots at the time. And then there was a scene that they had really kind of not forgotten about, but I guess it was the last scene that was designed, and that was the hot air balloon scene. So I think Claude was the one who asked me to come up with some ideas for what that scene would be. And so I did some very rudimentary chicken scratch pencil drawings for it. And the buildings made it. The buildings made it in, and sort of some aspects of it. And I can't remember whether there was something going on between Claude and Marc at the time. But Marc's idea, I think, what was it? Was it a pig that ended up in there in the basket of the hot air balloon?
That
I can't
sounds
even remember.
accurate. I'm trying to remember.
I think I had goats or something in there. The goats were like, meh, meh. And the hot air balloon was heading towards a steeple of a church and about ready to pop. And I think Claude said, that's too subtle, or it's too, people aren't going to get that. They're moving through. And he was probably right. But so some aspects of that scene made it in, and it was like, I'm just a grunt. I can't believe a grunt that's been there for like 5 or 6 weeks, and I'm kind of designing a scene because everyone's too busy to do it. So that was kind of weird. And I didn't really think much of it back at the time. And I'm like, I was not offended, but I was like, oh, they didn't like my idea that much. They only used the buildings. That was a lot for someone who was there for 4 or 5 weeks. That, was, I guess, kind of phenomenal. So then not much longer after that, then Tony Baxter came by, and he was instrumental in helping me get the job, because George Wyndham, asked Tony about him, because I had put on my resume or whatever that I had known Tony, and Tony had some exposure to some of the work I had done in high school and everything. So Tony was assigned the Imagination Pavilion. At the time, it was called Images and Imagination. It was a late, this is the summer of '79, and Kodak comes along and says they want a pavilion. And, in the meantime, there were other pavilions that were kind of late along, like the GE Pavilion and Life and Health, as it was called at the time, and Living Seas. But their sponsorships weren't, tied up yet. And so even though those were kind of further along in design, all of a sudden this imagination idea pops up, and we're off and running, and Tony needs someone to lay it out for him. And there's no architect available either. So not only from a ride standpoint, but there's no one to lay out the pavilion. So he asked me if I want to do that, and like, okay, I've, kind of laid some things out before. So the next thing I know, I'm laying out the pavilion and the ride. Again, it was very unusual, and I don't know what I really thought. I didn't like come home going, guess what I'm getting to do? I'm just like, okay, I guess that's what you do. I guess, and I didn't really think a lot of it. And it's like, it was fun to do, but I didn't think that it was, I don't know. I just didn't, I didn't appreciate it back then the way I appreciate it now.
Well, it's hard. I mean, especially at that age, it's got to be hard to sort of see the impact or the big picture of the whole thing.
Right. I didn't realize what an opportunity it was, that people were giving me. Tony was giving me, and people were letting Tony give that opportunity to me, because they could have said, no, you got to wait till we get an architect on board. So I was part of a group of people, a really great group. It would be so fun to kind of bring those people all back together. Barry Braverman, myself, Tony, of course, Tad Stones was borrowed from the studio. He was an animator. He still is an animator. And Andy Gaskell, who was an incredible talent and still an incredible talent. He went on to become the production designer, I think, on Lion King and some other Disney animated features. And he became kind of the main illustrator on the attraction. Well, Bob Rogers was initially part of this group. And John Stone, the model builder, later came along. And it was really fun to kind of just throw these ideas around. We didn't have any notion about what this thing would be. But as it began to develop, this idea of an introduction show to kind of ground everyone and get them on the same page. How do you explain imagination? So this idea of, a professor or a Dreamfinder came along, and this fantastic flying machine. And Steve Kirk was also, part of this team. So over the months, I began to develop, this idea of Dreamfinder and Figment. And Tony and Steve Kirk were fundamental in developing those two characters. And then Andy Gaskell in coming up with all these great ideas for how you could ride through these various zones, like literature and science. And so then I, started laying out the ride at that time. I had been laying out the building, which had other components to it back then. And, slowly we had to kind of pare that down. The garden was supposed to be a lot bigger. The garden area was going to be a whole optical illusion garden. So that got kind of pared down. By that time, this is probably by the winter now of 79, I think we had begun to define what this pavilion was. And then I went on to start laying out the ride itself, and then got really focused on the Dream Machine and on the turntable and how all of that would work.
What was one of the largest challenges about, your part of that process of that turntable?
Well, we were going through kind of back and forth on the ride system itself, because initially it was going to only be an Omnimover. And so that made it a little bit easier, I think, in syncing it up, with this big turntable that's divided up into 5 equal segments. And also the load was going to be on a turntable. I remember that, kind of a la the People Mover. And then as the attraction developed, and it really wasn't coming from creative, although creative certainly was saying that would be great, was the idea of making the vehicles variable speed, so that they could speed up, zoom, kind of do a little free fall and slow down. And so as that became more and more like the way it was going to go, then we were able to eliminate the turntable for the load area, because we could slow the vehicles down to the point where you could just walk onto them even though they're moving at a crawl. And then it was just a matter of, okay, how, making sure that each train of vehicles can get in and out of that turntable safely. And that was for someone else to figure out. But I had to work on all the timing of it, kind of the nominal timing chart, if you will. So I didn't realize it at the time. I basically created an exposure sheet for it, breaking it down into seconds. And it was just, this was before computers, before Photoshop, before anything. So I had to create a big cardboard turntable with little notches on it that represented seconds. And that's how we kind of figured out how the vehicles would be placed, how they'd come in, how they'd rotate, when you would first see the dream catching machine, when you would last see it. There were all these sightline and acoustic issues. And all of that was worked out on this giant, it was like 4x4 illustration board, thick cardboard turntable that you could rotate. And it helped the special effects people locate where they needed to put their effects projectors. And it was like a living kind of exposure sheet, because you had to look at it from the standpoint of the people in the seats. Where are they located? From the person on the furthest left, versus the person on the furthest right, there's some parallax that goes on between what they're seeing on the dream catching machine, and if Dreamfinder says something about a rainbow coming out and Figment's pointing to it, you've got to have it all kind of sync up for the person on the left and the person on the right. And so this was the best way to work that all out. And so I became kind of like the keeper of that timing chart, if you will.
So let me ask you about an Imagineering legend who you had some experience with, especially on Epcot, but everything really, and that's Marty Sklar.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, Marty was one of the major creative forces at Epcot and president of Imagineering for about a decade. What did Marty teach you, if anything, about the creative process along the way?
Well, I think he was one of the folks that certainly stressed the collaboration element of it, because when you're a young person who's been kind of chosen into this role, you can get full of yourself. So he would kind of keep you grounded and remind you that it's not all about you and it's not all about your ideas. But right away, you could see that he was doing a little bit like what Walt would do in terms of throwing very different kinds of people onto the same project. So at some point, Walt Paraguay was brought on board to bring in a different point of view, or to bring in a different kind of aspect of imagination, a more kind of free form, because that wasn't probably being represented in the version that we had. And so that kind of casting, being able to say, we're going to put, Tony on it and Bob Rogers and Walt Paraguay, mm-hmm. That could be a very dangerous thing, or it could be a very brilliant thing. And that's exactly what Walt Disney did. And so I'm sure that Marty learned from that. He witnessed that happen, and he knew that if you put oil and water together, it wouldn't necessarily create a big mess. It might actually, create something even better than anyone thought of before. And so I started to see that pretty early on. But also, it was very clear at the time that this was Marty's big passion. Mm-hmm. Epcot was his big passion. That this was something he wanted to see through. He may have been the person that was really poking Card Walker to keep on with the idea, because they certainly didn't. As soon as Walt died, they didn't need to go ahead with this very challenging and perplexing problem. We were building theme parks and hotels and resorts and making a lot of money from it. And Walt's not around anymore to tell us what Epcot needs to be. So it would have been very easy just to say, okay, we're not doing that. And yet it was announced in the middle of the 70s that they were going to move forward with some version of it. And it's often attributed to Card Walker, and I'm sure it is. I'm sure Card was passionate about it, but I wonder, was it Marty really pushing Card, or was it Card pushing Marty? I don't know. But it was very clear that this was something that Marty wanted to see through and wanted to be a meaningful thing. He wanted it to be meaningful and different than the Magic Kingdom.
So after Epcot, your story continues on, and you end up getting tasked as show producer for Fantasyland in Disneyland Paris, at the time, of course, known as Euro Disney. How much experience had you had with Europe before this, and was there specific adjustments that you wanted to make with your Fantasyland in comparison to the others when you had your shot?
I was the last person brought on that project from the creative standpoint, because the show producers were already selected, including the one for Fantasyland. I was working on a lot of Disneyland projects at the time. So I did the Facade for Star Tours, and I was working on many, many different iterations of a new Tomorrowland. And then I think I began doing I was in the middle of just starting to work on Indiana Jones, and what would that be? And I took a trip to Europe because I always wanted to go to Europe, but my passion for going to Europe was particularly sparked when Epcot opened, and I would often go into the Impressions de France film on breaks or lunches or before or after work. Particularly after when Epcot opened, the ride in Journey into Imagination was not ready. It didn't open for another 6 months. And so there was a lot of work still to do in it, but some days the crews wouldn't show up and I wouldn't have much to do. So I'd go in the Impressions to France. I loved that film, and I had to find out what all the pieces of music were and where the locations were. And that incentivized me to eventually take my first trip. Didn't happen until 1986. And I took a month-long trip that took me through Germany, Austria, Switzerland, a little bit of Italy, and a lot of France and England. And I fell in love with it, and it was just, amazing. It was everything was more incredible than I thought it would be. And I was like, I felt just lucky through luck. I fell into places that I had no idea would be useful, in the future, like the town of Rothenburg, Germany. I had no idea what that was, never heard of it, but it was a location that was used in the film Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. But more importantly, it was really kind of the biggest inspiration for the design of Fantasyland. The parts of Fantasyland that we all like at Disneyland, like Merlin's Magic Shop, and then the expansions that Tony did in 1983. Ron Bowman was the key architect on a lot of that, and Ron, said that he drew a lot of his inspiration from Rothenburg and had gone there many times. Well, I didn't know that until after the trip. So I stumble on this place. It's a walled city, medieval, and I'm staying in a little, I decided to stay there in this little half-timbered hotel that dates back to the 14th century. And, so needless to say, I'm taking hundreds of pictures, and I can't believe this, it's just everything's so incredible. And then Mont Saint-Michel in France is incredible, and just all these places. So I come back and I show these photos to Tony, and he says, wow, that's incredible, and he's starting to hire up for the Paris project, but he wants me on Disneyland stuff. So I'm like, bummer. So I'm working on Disneyland stuff, and then sometime in 1987, one of the show producers is moved to another project, and they need to fill that opening, and it's Fantasyland. So Tony asked me if I want to be part of it, and I'm like, of course I do. He said, the only caveat is it's already designed, except for the castle, but we already have like 5 people working on the castle, so you can't work on the castle. We can't have one more person working on the castle. And the basic elements of the land have already been established, meaning, the basic attractions and what architecture basically are they going to use for them. So I'm kind of like more of an art director than a creative director on it, or so I think. But soon there's an ask from Michael Eisner to look into doing a maze. So we start looking at a maze, and then it turns out there's a whole bunch of buildings that actually haven't been designed for the land yet. So even though it's been established that they're going to use Peter Pan and Pinocchio and Snow White from Disneyland, there are a lot of other little places and restaurants that do need to be designed. And so the trip to Europe that I had taken 2 years earlier, starts to come in handy, because I have all these really keen photographs and references of, places to look up and research further. And then the castle, I'm keeping an eye on the castle. I'm watching it, vicariously, and I'm watching people take, their passes at it, and just thinking it was just a gut thing. Now, maybe it was because I had gone through France, but I didn't really go to that many castles. I just, had an instinct for what I thought a castle in France needed to be. It needed to be French, but not look like all the other castles. It had to be distinctly different, but it still had to be French. And what I was seeing was stuff that was just kind of weird in my opinion. There were some really good people working on these things, but I'm like, Tony, is that really what you want? And Tony's like, no, actually, it's not what I want. Well, let me take a pass at it. And he's like, no, there's already too many people charging to it. So I think at some point he realized it's not coming along. And I said, I'll put together just an inspiration board. I'm not going to design anything, but I'll put together a board of like gleaned from different, sources, like from the Disney animated films, from storybooks, from Gustav Tenggren illustrations, and classic illustrations from fairy tale books from illustrators like John Bauer and I forget some of the other names. But so I put together this inspiration board, and he really liked it. And he said, well, okay, I guess you could go ahead and draw, take a stab at it. So then I started drawing something up, and he liked it. Next thing you know, I was working on that.
Were you mostly excited, or did you find yourself like, if I mess this up, it's on me?
Initially I was mostly excited. It got scary when it came time to really begin to define every square inch of it, because it was, it's a big job, and it had to be farmed out to 2 or 3 different people. And most of the work was done by a couple of outsiders that we hired. Marc Lesko was the official project architect stateside, but to actually draft it all up, to do all the beautiful individual drawings of every tower, every wall, every, all the surface area, we hired a guy named John Kasparowicz. He actually was with WED Enterprises at the time, but had just quit a few years earlier to form his own company. So he was out in Pomona. So I would have to go out to Pomona sometimes, and trying to wrangle all of the different design work that was going on in all these different places. Someone else was designing the tapestry. Someone else was designing the stained glass windows. Someone else was doing there's just a lot of work going on in different places. And so that's where it became a little panicky, because the deadline's coming up, and it's just becoming impossible to keep up with all of the work that's being done. So that's when it became scary. But in the initial design phase of it, it wasn't, because I guess I just knew kind of what it needed to be. I had done some castle design work. There was a castle I did in my portfolio in high school, I think. And then I did one for the Imagination Pavilion, because in the literature area, there's a castle that I had to design for that. I just felt like it was something I could do. I would build sandcastles when I lived at the beach, and they weren't ornate, but it was all about the placement of the towers, placement of it wasn't about like the detail of the windows. It was the basic form of it. And so I was kind of opinionated about it, and knew what it needed to be, and was quickly working with the model builders. And we started by just putting dowels, different diameters of dowels together to kind of confirm the drawing that I had done. And we started there. It was a very unconventional way to go. In hindsight, it wasn't, usually at that point, you're going to start with an architect and a structural engineer. You need to know where all the columns are going and everything to optimize the structural elements of it. And we just started with the model, and the architect and the structural engineer would say, yeah, we could do that. They were can-do people. And we worked a little bit backwards from the way we knew we wanted it to look, because it was very important. Form follows function, except if you're a castle and your castle is the icon and the face of the project, then its function is its form. And so it had to look right. And so building the model of it went pretty quickly, I would say. And there was a little challenge trying to figure out how we would fit the dragon in there. And I would do sections, plans and elevations and sections, kind of depicting how we could barely, squeeze it in there and not compromise the beautiful silhouette of the hill. And then once, we built the model, that kind of answered on the outside what it looks like, but all of the surface area on the inside, the vaulted ceilings and the columns, and what were the columns going to be? Are they going to be trees? Or are they going to be Gothic columns? All of that needed to be worked out. And that's when it became like crazy making. So that's when it became challenging. I think it was the summer of '88 when that work was being done. and that was rough. And then all of that information had to be then transferred to France and turned into official working drawings, because in France you can't build from American drawings. You have to build from drawings that have been certified by French engineers and French architects. So there was some cut and paste, but then there was additional, all the kind of interstitial pieces and parts that hadn't been figured out in the United States had to be figured out in France. And so suddenly I'm flying back out to France while work is still going on in California. That's when it got crazy.
I have 1,000 different questions because you've done so much great stuff, but we'll end today with a question about Hong Kong. After Paris, of course, 2005, you were in control. You had creative oversight of Hong Kong Disneyland. And what I'm curious about is you've had experiences with other at this point, you've done Paris and you've had experiences with other cultures. What surprised you most about the creativity of Hong Kong and its artists, and how did that inspire what you did?
I learned that lesson first in France, that, there are highly creative people everywhere. It's not just Los Angeles or Orlando or New York kind of a thing. And so I think by the time we had gone out to Hong Kong, it was a foregone conclusion that we would need to rely on local artists to get not only the finished work done, but then to continue on with conceptual ideas for the park. So I don't think it was a surprise. I'm trying to think what was a surprise out there. I mean, I had never been to Hong Kong before until the year 2000, and I didn't realize what a beautiful city and what a fun, city it was, and very diverse, with people all over the world living there, bringing their different perspectives.
Well, Tom K. Morris, I can't thank you enough for being here on Dreamfinders. Thanks so much for joining us and chatting a little bit about your experiences with the parks.
You're very welcome. Anytime. Just, give me a call and we'll chat some more.
And that's it for this episode of Dreamfinders. Thanks so much to Tom K. Morris for talking with me, and we'll just have to take him up on his offer sometime for another chat. You can keep up with all Tom has got going on, plus lots of pictures from his time at Disney, on his Twitter, @TomKMorris. Our podcast artwork is provided by JP Tanner. Find his other work at tanwoodcreative.com. This podcast is distributed by WDW News Today, the worldwide leader in Disney Parks news. Read all they have to offer at WDWNT.com. Dreamfinders is hosted and produced by yours truly, Nathan Hartman, who you can follow on Twitter @SomeStuffISaid. Tell your friends about the show, and please, please, please give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It means a lot and helps others find us. Also, if you or someone else you know would make a great guest, feel free to email us at dreamfinders@WDWNT.com. I'm Nathan Hartman, and remember, if we can dream it, then we can do it. Dreamfinders is sponsored by Never Grow Up Vacations, the official travel partner of WDWNT.com. Never Grow Up Vacations specializes in trips to Disney destinations around the world, so be like us and never grow up. Head over to nevergrowupvacations.com to book your next trip today.